Speaking of poetry and haiku, we have a mutual acquaintance in Gabriel Rosenstock.
Absolutely.
One of his haikus was the source for the title of your book. Do you know Gabriel pretty well?
I haven't ever met him in person, at least not yet, but we've been friends over the internet for several years. And I was just immediately floored by his wonderful poetry when I first encountered his writings. And we've had a good internet friendship. We've periodically exchanged emails or suggested new poets to read. And he's just a fascinating man and an excellent poet. Certainly someone everyone out there who likes contemporary poetry should check out. He's an Irish poet, but you can find many of his works, his collections in America and in Canada as well. By the way, as you were hinting, one of the things he's best known for is his haiku, which he often will write in both English and in Irish. He's very active in the movements to restore the Irish language, and particularly within, of course, literary circles. And so a lot of his poetry is composed in both Irish and English, and much of it is haiku. This was one of his haiku that I just immediately fell in love with. I shared with the rest of the Poetry Chaikhana community through some emails, and everyone just immediately had a strong reaction to. A star, a tree, and the longing in between. A star, a tree, and the longing in between. Isn't that wonderful? To me, it just holds so much. You know, as you said, this was obviously the poem that gave the title to this anthology, The Longing in Between. And so I feature it in the introduction of the book with a few thoughts about it. And one of the reasons I particularly drew the title from this poem, other than the obvious that it's just such a wonderful line, the longing in between, is that to me, this very short haiku, which, as I say, isn't even really a complete sentence or a complete thought, it still holds so much and suggests so much to us about the spiritual endeavor, the spiritual journey, because we've got the light of the star and the life of the tree and this sort of terrible gulf or void in the longing in between. But that longing also suggests to us an ache or a yearning, or as I put it in the introduction, an aching heart that impels us onward. But also this idea of longing, you know, within spiritual communities, spiritual groups, we're often very focused on the end point, you know, that moment of realization or awareness, or of dropping our false ideas, however we frame it. You know, we're always focused on that moment of enlightenment that kind of redeems all the messy struggle along the way. But one of the points that I try to make as I'm discussing my thoughts about Gabriel Rosenstock's poem is the importance of longing, the centrality of longing in the spiritual journey, that there really isn't a spiritual journey without longing. We're always looking for that sense of union or of awakening to non-dual reality without remembering that it was that crisis of perceived separation that set us on that pathway, whatever that pathway was, towards that goal. Whether we feel we've reached it, whether we feel like it's an ongoing process, it becomes an essential motivator. If it's okay with you, I'd like to read just a couple lines from the introduction where I'm talking about this and linking it back to this idea of mysticism. And I say that the mystic maps the territory between the soul and God, between the lover and beloved, between the little self and the true self, between the transitory and the eternal. The mystic maps that territory. The road connecting these is the road of longing. So mysticism, all of the spiritual quest, can be seen in some sense as the science of longing, understanding the longing, feeling it, yielding to it, and then following where it leads us. Because ultimately longing is connected in some sense to its resolution. Longing is connected in some way to that sense of union or awakening to non-dual truth. So longing isn't something to be pushed behind us or to be swept under the rug or to somehow be transcended. In a lot of sacred language, longing is the pathway to its own fulfillment in union, in awakening. And so I felt like all of the poems in this anthology, The Longing in Between, are about the process of seeking and also of awakening, and everything in between, the longing in between. I'm so grateful to Gabriel Rosenstock for allowing me to share this poem in this anthology. A star, a tree, and the longing in between. Isn't that great?
Yeah, it's beyond great, because my own mandate for these interviews is to allow the person's soul to be exposed, and maybe that's the key word of the soul, longing. What's their longing?
Yes.
And maybe it's the poets that really can do that. Any of your friends poets in this genre?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, in addition to, of course, Gabriel Rosenstock, I have a few friends actually write in a similar area. They live nearby me. One is a wonderful poet named Dorothy Walters. She might even be known to some people in your non-duality community. She's published several books. One of her best known is Marrow of Flame. She's a wonderful poet. She's a woman, I believe she's in her 80s now. And, she was a university professor for years. She's, retired now. And later in life, she went through some profound transformative experiences that she identified with the Kundalini experience, not following a particular teacher or school of thought. It happened somewhat spontaneously for her. And she just started writing some truly wonderful poetry. I have, I think, one of her poems selected in this anthology, but she's been a real favorite with a lot of other people I know. So she's an excellent poet. Another very good poet in the area is Elizabeth Reninger, and she's had one collection of poetry. She writes some really excellent poetry, often from a rather Taoist or Buddhist background, very observational about perfect moments in nature or observing nature. I really like her as well. There are several other excellent poets that I know in some sense where I exchange occasional emails or maybe a phone call. But those two are two close friends whom I highly respect as poets as well.
You have a poem in your book by Elizabeth Reninger called Bird Bath.
I do. Would you like me to read that?
I thought you'd never ask.
Okay. Bird Bath by Elizabeth Reninger. Only this matters, this ecstatic baptism, this standing on stick-thin legs where the singing creek pools at the lip of the waterfall, this standing on stick-thin legs where the singing creek pools at the lip of the waterfall. Only this, ruby-feathered chest diving to meet its reflection. This beak piercing again and again that quivering surface, these wings half unfolding, a ruffle of joy guiding rivers of light a tumble of droplets dressed in rainbows along your hidden spine, shattering all decorum beneath blue branches in quiet ascent. Shattering all decorum beneath blue branches in quiet ascent.
And assent is spelled A-S-S-E-N-T.
Yes, assent, as in, acceptance or willingness or saying yes to the experience in quiet assent. That's one I really like by Elizabeth Reninger. And part of what I like about this particular poem is, although it's obviously much longer, it has some aspects that remind me somewhat of a haiku poem. We have this little snapshot of a moment in nature. We've got a red-breasted bird. I think of it as a robin, and it's standing in a creek, some little creek, and right at the edge of a little waterfall in that creek where the water kind of pools just before it tumbles over the edge. And so we have this kind of interesting still point of the moving water, and it just is pooling, just barely stopping for a moment before it tumbles over that edge. And at that edge point, we have this robin, or this red-breasted bird, standing there on its stick-thin legs. And it plunges into its own reflection. It sees its reflection and it pierces it with its beak as it's plunging, giving itself a bath at this little pool at the edge of this little waterfall. So this image of this bird seeing its own reflection and then piercing its reflection, plunging into itself to experience this, what she describes as rivers of light, tumbling these droplets down its secret spine or its hidden spine. Again, on the one hand, she's describing simply a bird fluffing out its feathers and diving under the water for a second and giving itself a bath. But on the other hand, it can evoke this sense of spiritual, kind of almost explosive spiritual awakening in this very still point right on the edge of this waterfall. And to me, I just find that to be both meditative but also invigorating. It just somehow, you feel this explosion of simple movement that somehow cleanses and reawakens this little bird. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to share that poem in this anthology.
The word assent?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We've got that double meaning of, on the one hand, it's a sense of saying yes to this present moment, but also we get ascent, as you're saying, of rising up, of transcendence. Yeah, it's a beautiful little play on words that, even if you're not thinking of it consciously, you've got it playing on your unconscious a bit, and that layered meaning is a really nice touch.
Do you give local readings?
Occasionally. Honestly, it's been fairly rare in the past. I just did a local reading a few weeks ago in honor of the publication of The Longing in Between. I am beginning to look at doing that a bit more. Part of the reason is because I'm moving more into having additional books published, and I want to find ways to reach out to people who may not be familiar with me or the poetry Chaikhana, but who would find a lot of inspiration and meaning in some of these books that I've already published and that will be coming out in the future. So although it's been rather limited in the past, I probably will be scheduling some more readings over the coming months. But I don't have anything else scheduled at the moment.
I really like this one. I wonder if you could read it. It's on page 68.
Oh, yes. This is a poem by Lalla, or Lalla Shwari, or sometimes her name will be rendered as Laldead or Laldidi, just to make it confusing for us. It's all the same poet. She's a really beloved poet, a yogic poet. She was a devotee of Shiva in Kashmir, in what is today northern India, Pakistan, that border region. And she wrote some wonderful yogic-inspired poetry. Here's a short one. One shrine to the next. The hermit can't stop for breath. Soul, get this. You should have looked in the mirror. Going on a pilgrimage is like falling in love with the greenness of far away grass. One shrine to the next. The hermit can't stop for breath. Soul, get this. You should have looked in the mirror. Going on a pilgrimage is like falling in love with the greenness of far away grass.
Looking back at what we talked about as far as longing, there's a longing that can take a person away from what's seen in that mirror, and there's a longing that can bring a person to stay with what's seen in the mirror.
That's such a great statement. I'm not sure I've quite thought of it in those terms, but I completely agree with you. And I think most of us who see ourselves as pursuing a spiritual path in one form or another have experienced both intensely. I know for myself, for example, a significant part of my journey as an adolescent and young adult was very much about trying to escape into some sort of bigger, better, other, more magical sense of reality. That was a big part of how I saw the spiritual journey for myself for many, many years. And some of it was literally running from place to place, as she's describing, just trying to search for something, feeling that terrible ache and just feeling like I didn't even know what it was I was fully hungry for, but I had to find it. And so I was reading every book I could and traveling to new places, living in several different locations, but then also coming to that point where that longing turns around or turns in on itself and somehow blossoms into some sort of deep presence wherever you are. That to me is like when longing finally recognizes itself for what it is and leads you right into your own feet, if you know what I mean. Both forms of longing are so strong and compelling. And part of the work, I think, is recognizing the first longing, even if it makes you feel a bit ungrounded or erratic or not sure even what you're looking for, but then letting that longing come to a sort of a fruition that brings you back to where you are. And I think that's a bit of what Lalla is suggesting in that poem we just read. The real pilgrimage is to discover oneself, to discover the deep self, looking in the mirror.
Ivan, would you read one of your own poems that you've written?
Oh, sure, I'd love to. This is a really short one, but it's one that a number of people have liked. It's called Parched. The parched know. Real thirst draws rainwater from an empty sky. The parched know. Real thirst draws rainwater from an empty sky. And actually that one in some ways builds on that discussion of longing. Thirst is another way to conceive of that longing. And so real thirst draws rainwater from an empty sky. If I could, why don't I jump over to one other poem of mine, a poem called Holy Ground. Let the vision of the vastness you are leave you in glorious ruins. Let the vision of the vastness you are leave you in glorious ruins. Pilgrims will come to imagine the grand temple that once stood, not realizing the wreck made this empty plain holy ground.
The holiness of ruins.
Yes, yeah, yes. That to me, that's a poem about the sense of profound spaciousness, where there's really not much you left, and that just that empty plain and the ruins of, if you want to call it, an ego or a little self. I notice so many spiritual teachers and gurus and students come to them so eager to find out all of the fascinating spiritual adventures they went to or went through to get to the point that they're at. And there's a beautiful sense of the narrative of each individual's journey, but there's also a tendency to forget that it's not really that journey that led that teacher to whatever space they're in that's so important. It's that emptiness that they now experience that's what really makes them holy ground. It's the wreck, the empty plain, that's the holy ground that the student is drawn to, and not so much whatever structure may have stood there before. If you like, I can mention something that I talk a little bit about in the introduction to this anthology, The Longing in Between, about what I think is particularly significant about sacred poetry in this era. There's still such terrible sense of a divide or sectarianism among many of the great world religions. Of course, right now in the West, there's a continuing paranoia about extremist Islam, for example. Yet, as we mentioned earlier, Rumi is one of the most widely read and loved poets in the West. So you get this interesting thing where poetry has a way of transcending the theological incrustation of each religious tradition. And it's much more personal. It speaks much more directly to the listener or the reader. And it seems to say something about sacred experience on a much more personal level than reading more traditional sacred scripture, for example. And so in this way, this very direct way, sacred poetry, in my opinion, becomes a sort of goodwill ambassador among the various religious and spiritual traditions. It opens up dialogue and mutual understanding, mutual respect. But also, there's something else that's not recognized widely, and that's that sacred poetry is really a natural outpouring of the sacred experience. I say in the book that all mystics write poetry universally. I say it this way: saints and sages, shamans and seers, wise women and medicine men, they all sing songs, they riddle, they rhyme. And the reason for this is that numinous experiences, transcendental experiences, experiences of non-dual reality, these are not easily communicated through words. The sacred can be witnessed, the eternal can be witnessed and participated in, but not conveyed through limited concepts. So any attempt to communicate what is perceived in these states of all-encompassing unity and deep mental quiet, it's necessarily an act of translation. I feel that prose tends to be a poor medium for that task of trying to describe what is being witnessed and experienced and understood, because prose it's a descriptive language, and it works best with known definitions and accepted meaning. So prose becomes a language of boundaries, in effect. Yet these most profound experiences just aren't contained in the sort of boundaries that prose works best with. Poetry, on the other hand, doesn't define, it suggests. Where prose describes, poetry allows meaning to gather. That elastic nature of poetry that makes it so well suited for the sacred. And it enables language to relay truth without attempting to circumscribe it or fence it in. For this reason, I feel that sacred poetry isn't just beautiful, it isn't just inspiring, it's not even simply a medium of awakening, it's also culturally hugely important, because where there are cultural tensions, especially on these religious levels, sacred poetry naturally opens up interchange. And then we also have this natural quality that allows us to get past a lot of our mental preconceptions that we attach to formal ideas of religion, where you get a lot of theological overlay that makes it very hard often to just come very open and clear-sighted to a lot of the great religious writings. But sacred poetry just allows us to see the living heart of a living mystic within that tradition. And the more we come across that, the more we recognize that there is something very similar going on among all of these mystics at the heart of these different world religions. And they're saying something very similar, often using very similar language. And for this reason, this natural quality of poetry, this suggestive and indicative quality of poetry rather than defining quality of poetry, we get so many of these saints and holy people and figures, seekers, visionaries, writing poetry. You know, it's not just that we have Rumi and Kabir. We have all of these great Catholic saints from the Middle Ages, Eastern Orthodox saints. We have all of these great yogis, all of these great Sikhs, and of course, many of the great Muslim mystics and Sufis. We get into the Buddhist just across the globe. The real seekers, the people who are really determined not to just fulfill a religious role, but to really experience the living, radiant core of their own spiritual tradition. Mystics, these people are often poets. Often they can't even restrain their poetry. Poetry just comes out. Even if they write in more of a prose form, it often will have a very poetic quality to it. And that's just a kind of a natural outpouring of the mystic's experience in many cases. And again, that's coming back to what you were saying. This is a big reason why I've been drawn to sacred poetry in the sense of the poetry of mystics, and why I formed the Poetry Chaikhana and why some of these books are being published, is to find more of these voices and allow us to gain more of this insight into these very personal, profound insights of awakening, of experience of unity and non-dual awareness.
Ivan Granger, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks a lot. It's been just a real delight to talk with you.
Ivan Granger writes, "The spiritual journey is about discovering the very real sweetness that you are." And if you love how Ivan speaks, read his book, The Longing in Between. For more details, go to poetry-chaikhana.com. Chaikhana is spelled Chaikhana. This is Nonduality Talk. Our website is nonduality.org. Our opening and closing music is by the Canadian artist Prasad from the album Transitar. I'm Jerry Katz.